In 1906, Dr. Alois Alzheimer requested to examine the brain of a patient named Augusta Dieter, who appeared to have no sense of time or place and could barely remember basic details of her life. In her brain, he found abnormalities that remain to be the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease today, making Augusta the first known patient with the disease.
Now here's the even more striking thing. If Augusta had instead been alive today, we could offer her no more help than Alois was able to 114 years ago.
In a 2015 TED Talk, Samuel Cohen points out that despite having discovered the disease more than 100 years ago, no real progress has been made in the fight against Alzheimer's. Cohen explains that Alzheimer's is certainly not a normal part of aging, and it is a disease that can be cured.
We've managed to identify a critical step in the process, and are now testing a new class of drugs which should specifically block this step and stop the disease.
However, while Cohen and his team's work will surely be productive, it is very unlikely that a single drug will cure the disease. That is not to say that the disease cannot be treated, but why is this? And what does Alzheimer's have to do with babies? And finally, what do babies, coconut oil, and breast milk all have in common? To understand, let's start with a story from Dr. Mary Newport. In May 2008, her husband Stephen received an MRI and was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. That same year, Mary took Steve to the University of South Florida, hoping that he'd be able to qualify for a new vaccine study that might help his condition. Unfortunately, he was able to achieve the necessary score of a 16 on a mental state examination to qualify for the study. He only scored a 12. Around this time, Mary had heard of an upcoming drug called Kedicin, or AC1202, which brought about significant improvement over a 90-day period in half of subjects with a specific genetic profile. In a pilot study, some Alzheimer's patients improved on memory testing with the very first dose. Mary then learned that the promising ingredient in Kedicin is MCT oil, and that the dosing was just 20 grams. Mary found out that the MCT oil was derived from coconut oil, and calculated that 35 grams of coconut oil should contain 20 grams of MCT oil, so she put this amount, a little bit more than 2 tablespoons, in Steve's morning oatmeal. 4.5 hours after having his breakfast, Steve went again to the University of South Florida to be retested for the same trial mentioned earlier. This time, he scored an 18 on the mental state examination, 2 points higher than the necessary 16. 60 days after Steve began taking the coconut oil for its MCT content, Dr. Newport wrote this case study, commenting that he is able to concentrate on things that he wants to do and stay on task, whereas before coconut oil, he was easily distractible and rarely accomplished anything. Here are 3 clocks he drew as part of a mental examination. One the day before he started taking the coconut oil, and one just 2 weeks after, and one 37 days after. Now, this is just one anecdote, and the MCT and coconut oil did not cure Steve's Alzheimer's, but he did improve significantly. MCT, or medium-chain triglycerides, are not usually a significant part of the average adult's diet. A baby, however, would be getting a reasonable amount of them from breast milk. In fact, MCTs are added to commercial infant formulas to mimic the composition of breast milk. And MCTs are even stored in babies' fat tissue. What's interesting about MCT oil is that it acts as a different source of fuel for the brain rather than glucose. Just to be clear, blood glucose is the same as blood sugar, which rises when you eat carbohydrates. Late last month, I had the chance to interview Amy Berger, author of The Alzheimer's Antidote, where she explained the significance of not having to rely on sugar, that is glucose, for fuel.
I would say Alzheimer's is a fuel shortage or an energy crisis in the brain. And where that comes from is that the major problem in the brain of somebody with Alzheimer's is that neurons in affected parts of the brain lose the energy to effectively metabolize glucose. So they're basically starving. They're starving for energy, they're withering, they're shrinking. You can see the volume of the brain shrinking on an MRI. You can see that it's smaller. And all that comes because the brain is starved for fuel. And the brain is what we call an energy-intensive organ. It only accounts for about 2% of an adult's body weight, but it uses between 20 and 25% of all the glucose and oxygen. So the brain, you cannot have an interrupted fuel supply to the brain or you're going to be in major trouble.
In her book, Amy explains that compared to healthy people, Alzheimer's disease patients have shown up to 45% reductions in cerebral metabolic rate of glucose. essentially up to a 45% reduction in the rate the brain uses glucose for energy. It's almost always observed that the Alzheimer's brain is under-metabolizing glucose. So what is going on here? Are we seeing that the brain cells have died? Or is it that they are alive and just unable to utilize glucose? If the cells were dead, then, as Dr. Stephen Cunning points out here, those cells shouldn't be able to use any sort of fuel. As he shows on this slide, you can see that as indicated by less red shading, glucose uptake progressively reduces as you progress from mild cognitive impairment to Alzheimer's disease. However, the Alzheimer's brain has no problem using ketones for energy. Not only that, as he shows here, the Alzheimer's brain actually uptakes ketones better than controls. Very simply put, ketones are a source of energy naturally produced in the body from fat when dietary carbohydrate is restricted enough. So, if the key problem with Alzheimer's is that the brain is lacking adequate fuel due to an inability to utilize glucose, then it makes sense that providing an alternate fuel would cause improvements. The significance of the earlier mentioned medium-chain triglyceride, MCT oil, is that MCTs are quickly transported from the gut to be rapidly oxidized in the liver and turned into ketones. For example, in comparison to the long-chain oleic acid, the medium-chain caprylic acid is oxidized 5 times faster in liver cells. To highlight this point, here's Dr. Cunning showing that after 6 months of 30 grams of MCT oil supplementation, people with mild cognitive impairment show a doubling of the uptake of ketones into the brain. However, this doesn't matter if getting more MCT oil into the stomach and getting more ketones into the brain doesn't improve cognitive function. But it does. Dr. Cunning shows here that 6 months of MCT supplementation improves scores on a battery of cognitive tests in people with mild cognitive impairment. It seems that anything from weight loss to diabetes to arthritis to brain fog, you'll find someone saying that the ketogenic keto diet is the answer. However, while ketones and ketosis may seem like the new fad on the block being sold as a panacea, ketosis is not a new thing at all, because virtually every human has been in ketosis at the start of their life. As Dr. George Cahill showed in this 2006 paper, newborns are essentially starting out in ketosis at a level of about 0.5 millimoles, which is considered nutritional ketosis. By comparison, an adult, depending on their diet, would have to fast for at least 13 hours to produce that same level of ketones. And a newborn can reach far more than that initial level simply by not eating for a little more than 3 hours, something that would take more than an entire day of fasting for an adult to achieve. As this 1986 paper reveals, ketone bodies could account for as much as 25% of the neonate's basal energy requirements in the first several days of life. And it has been shown that ketones can provide up to 60% of the energy requirements for an adult brain. Babies may be living on ketones even before birth. In his book on the health potential of ketones, Dr. Muneta Tetsuo, director of the Muneta Maternity Clinic in Japan, explains that pregnant women, whether they are restricting carbohydrate or not, are producing higher than normal level of ketones. By comparing the mother's blood with the newborn's umbilical cord blood, he found that out of 416 cases, 70% of babies were born with even higher levels of ketones than that of the mother. By analyzing the villi that provide contact with the mother's blood to the fetal membrane, Muneta deduced that the fetus must be living in an environment of elevated ketones from the start of pregnancy. And even a month after birth, babies on average had a blood ketone level 5 times higher than that of a normal person. So what's interesting about human babies' brains is that while they have an even higher demand for energy, as much as 3 times as what the adult brain requires, they're relying on ketones, a fuel that modern people rarely utilize, because fasting or heavy carb restriction are what is necessary to get an adult into ketosis. And while Alzheimer's patients are having trouble using glucose for energy, their brains, like a baby's brain, can run just fine on ketones. But, of course, most people have no trouble running their brains on glucose. In fact, it was thought for a while that the brain could only run on glucose. So what is going on that messes up the brain's ability to take up glucose? I can't share the whole picture in this one video, but for starters, consider this. It's estimated that 80% of Alzheimer's patients have insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. Just to clarify, insulin resistance is what leads to type 2 diabetes. And women as young as 24 years old with a form of insulin resistance due to polycystic ovary syndrome have reduced metabolism of glucose in the brain that looks strikingly similar to what you'd see in a 65-year-old brain. In fact, Alzheimer's is frequently referred to as type 3 diabetes. Though it's not as simple as you first get type 2 diabetes and then you progress to type 3 diabetes from there.
So I guess the logical step would be, okay, you get type 2 diabetes and then you progress into type 3 diabetes. Is that accurate?
Partly, but not fully. So having type 2 diabetes is a risk factor for Alzheimer's or cognitive decline. So you are at increased risk to have dementia later in life if you're a type 2 diabetic. But not everybody with type 2 diabetes will develop Alzheimer's, and not everyone who has Alzheimer's had or has type 2 diabetes. So the thing is, when we talk about type 2 diabetes, we only ever talk about blood sugar, blood glucose. They never look at insulin. So there's a lot of people walking around right now with totally normal blood sugar. But the blood sugar is only normal because it's being kept in check by sky-high insulin. And in a lot of modern illnesses, what we call non-communicable diseases, meaning not something you can catch like a cold or a flu, not something contagious, some kind of chronic illness that's not like type 2 diabetes, like obesity, PCOS, cardiovascular disease, these non-contagious illnesses. So many of these are driven by chronically high insulin, even when blood sugar is normal. So you can get any of those things, whether it's hypertension, PCOS, gout, like all these things that are driven by high insulin, even when people's sugar is normal. And the same is true for Alzheimer's. Chronically high insulin is a major risk factor for Alzheimer's, regardless of what genes you have.
Here's Dr. Bredesen explaining the case of a physician who was basically a genius, having gone to a major university when he was only 15 years old, but as of 2014 was suffering cognitive impairment. As a classically trained physician, he was very skeptical of Dr. Bredesen's approach.
So everything I would say is, that's not important, that's not important. So finally, after a few minutes, I said, look, give me 6 months. If I can't make you better in 6 months, then go elsewhere. He said, there is no place else.
On the program, he drastically reduced his fasting insulin and made significant improvements in other important markers. More importantly, his cognition improved significantly. In just 3 months, his wife called Dr. Bredesen to tell him how much sharper he had become. Dr. Bredesen wrote that in just 10 months, he went from struggling to perform mentally to seeing patients full-time. Interestingly, the volume of his hippocampus increased, going from the 17th percentile to the 75th percentile. The neuroradiologist who did the second MRI insisted that the apparent increase in brain volume was a mistake, because they had never seen that in the 75,000 scans they had done at the hospital. So Dr. Bredesen took the films to be analyzed elsewhere and confirmed that this person had indeed increased the volume of their hippocampus on the program. This is just one person, but not the only person who made improvements on the program. Dr. Bredesen published a research paper in 2016 documenting 9 more cases of patients who improved biomarkers and their cognition on his program. And there are still many more undocumented cases. Dr. Bredesen says that there are at least 3 types of Alzheimer's, so if you are trying to treat or prevent it, your approach will be different depending on which type you have. Alzheimer's is, as you expect, complicated. But that does not mean that there is not plenty of useful information out there. Just because there's not a single pill or even a handful of pills we can hold up and say is the cure to Alzheimer's, that doesn't mean that there's no way to prevent, stall, or even reverse the disease.
Today we are going to talk about brains, and we're going to do a little bit of a recap on one other lesson because I think it really ties into this lesson, and then we're going to come back and I'm going to teach you a few reasons why I continue on the ketogenic diet. So let's get started. I am going to start by saying ketones. Ketones are a bridge ketones bridge the brain gap. Let's try that again. Ketones bridge the brain gap. So we're going to go back one slide, and I want you to take a look at this in hopes that you remember one of the other slides that I spent a lot of time unpacking, which is this study saying when we studied glucose and ketones, we found that in healthy brains that, unlike what I learned in medical school, ketones are preferred over glucose when they're available. It's really important that you pay attention to those words, when they're available. If all your brain has for fuel is glucose, by golly, it will use a ton of glucose. But if you look at that red line way at the bottom, those ketones on day 4 and how red that brain is, that is 4 days into a strict ketogenic diet in healthy people where they found their ketones were very high by day 4, and look at how much of their brain is being fueled by ketones. So that's healthy brains. Today, we're going to talk about ketones and how they bridge this brain gap when it comes to energy. So as a physician studying internal medicine, I get to see lots of brains that are aging. So in this study, they looked at a ketogenic diet using medium chain triglycerides. And they're here to show, the study shows that it increases the brain metabolism in Alzheimer's disease. And we bring this up because that last slide and that last slide deck that I did a whole lecture on, it really focused on healthy brains. And people say, well, what about mine? I have depression, I have bipolar, I have Parkinson's, I have a tremor. And so I picked one of the most diseased brains, one of the toughest brains to talk to patients about, which is Alzheimer's. And that's what this study focuses on. So we're going to start by looking at this slide where it shows the brain energy. So this might be obvious, but your brain should have 100% energy. All the cells in your brain should be fueled. So this chart just focuses on the 70% brain fuel, 80% brain fuel, 90% brain fuel, and 100% brain fuel. So what happens in brains that aren't working very well is they don't have enough fuel for all of the cells. We call this a brain energy gap. And this is represented here by this white box. Think of this line at the bottom as the 88th percent. At 88% of the fuel for the brain, it does not work so well. And in Alzheimer's, that's very well studied, that when they get below 88%, their memory lapses. They're not doing very well. There's several other studies that show that brain fuel is not doing so well when brains become insulin resistant, which is why this study is applicable for the rest of you. So let's take a look at this chart. It shows that these are this young, healthy control group. So unlike the rest of the chart that you're going to see here, these people were young, and you can see that their brain fuel goes all the way to the top. The red part of the bar is the part of their brain that was fueled by glucose. That top little 5% is the part that was fueled by ketones. And you can see that there's a zero energy gap. They have 100% of their brain being fueled. That sounds pretty ideal. Yep, they were young and healthy. Now we took an older set, but they didn't have any memory problems. We tested their memory, and they performed just great. But these next several bars, including this one, are folks in their 70s, up into their 80s. So if you look, that glucose supplies the brain with 89% of its needed fuel. So it's just 1% over what it needs to be for nobody to notice that anything's wrong with their brain. They have 3% of their brain using ketones, and they have 8% of their brain that's going without fuel. And this is the part that's hidden. Even though these older folks tested normal, when we looked at their PET scans, we could see that there was 8% of their brain cells that had no fuel to do the things that they were asking it to do. And that's the part that I think is the scariest. In Alzheimer's, in brains that age, there is this hidden component that lingers for years before patients have symptoms. These phases of not having symptoms happen in other diseases as well, but I think Alzheimer's demonstrates it the best. And there's a ton of research on it, so I have good scans and good graphs for you. Let's now look at somebody with mild memory problems. So again, this would be considered mild cognitive disease. So if I was doing a test of their memory, I would say that they didn't outright fail it. They just scored low enough on the memory test and low enough on that screening test for Alzheimer's that I'm a little worried. I'm not sure that driving a car might be the best idea. There'll be some other things that I'm worrying about in a patient who scores with mild cognitive impairment. If you'll look, though, look at that fuel. It has sunk down to 85% of that brain is being fueled by glucose. Still 3% is being fueled by ketones, and it is under that 88% threshold. That's where that memory problem shows up. And when folks come in and say, hey, I just have a little bit of a problem on that memory test, I think I can try harder. What I want them to focus on is there is a larger gap of your brain that's going without fuel. And there is an answer that you can do to bridge this gap, this missing energy gap. The title is going to give it away. All right, let's move on to people who had this mild cognitive problem, and they took 30 grams of MCT every day. This went on for a month, and we studied their brain scans as they looked at the increasing rise in ketones in their blood, and then watch what happens to the increase in their energy fuel for their brain. So first of all, they were down to 84% of their glucose, of their brain was being fed by glucose. So again, that's much lower than it should be. Their ketones, though, had risen to 7% of their brain fuel, was now being used to bridge the gap of energy. They were down to only 9% of a gap in their energy gap, whereas the people without any MCT had closer to 12%. Last but not least, we have the column that shows you what happens if they did 45 grams of MCT. For those of you that are new to keto, MCT stands for medium chain triglycerides, and these are very special fats that slip through the intestine without a traditional way of being absorbed and digested. They actually are ported through the portal vein. They're ported to your liver, and they turn into ketones. After you consume MCT, it does take about half an hour to an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, to get the ketones into your circulation, to measure them in your circulation. But that medium chain triglyceride are ketones made by your liver, but they are supplied by this very special size fat that is 8 carbons or 10 carbons long. I have another video on that, and I'm going to not get distracted with that detail. So if you look at these folks with the 45 grams of MCT, and again, they were the folks who tested with mild cognitive impairment. They weren't the severe Alzheimer's. This is just mild cognitive impairment. And they too fell below that threshold for meeting the needs of their brain. Their glucose was 84% of the brain was being fueled by glucose. And when they added 45 grams of MCT, 10% of their brain was fueled by ketones. This left only 6% of their brain to have a brain energy gap. I would just point out that the people who were testing normally, these folks tested their brain scans showed even more of their brain being properly fueled, meeting the demands that their brain was asking for. Now, this can get a little sciencey and you can get a little overwhelmed, but I just want you to really focus on that we're talking about brain energy here. And brain energy is almost always fueled by glucose when you're not on a ketogenic diet. In fact, in medical school, I believed and I was taught that brains can only use glucose. It's just that time right before you die when you're starving to death that you'd ever use a ketone in the brain. That's what I was taught. But here indeed, as we've continued to learn about the ketogenic diet and why it's so powerful in the anti-seizure movements and in other brain disorders, it's this next part that is powerful. So there is your ketone, there is your glucose columns for the healthy people on the far right or far left. And then as you move across, all of them are in their 70s, except for that first column. The second column did not have a memory problem. The other three did. So as you look, here's that part that has the brain energy gap. Again, anything below 88% was going to show a positive on my test. If 88% of the cells in their brain were properly fueled, then I couldn't find the memory problem. But if there was any part missing, then I saw this brain energy gap. As we look at what happens in healthy people, you can fill that top 5% with ketones in the healthy people. You can fill about 3% in the elderly that were still testing normally in their memory problems. And as we move forward into those, the middle column did not have any supplements. They did have mild cognitive disorder, and they had a large 12% of their brain was starving, screaming for fuel. We moved that, we bridged the gap with ketones in the column that's number 4, and we bridged it even better when we increased the dose of medium chain triglycerides to 94% of their brain was properly fueled. This is an incredible and remarkable finding to say, when I first learned about Alzheimer's, we didn't have any idea that they could use a different fuel. We talk about Alzheimer's as being a brain that's not working well. And the studies that looked into this really poured energy into finding out, are we certain that these elderly brains that aren't working right can use a different fuel? And the PET scans found in this study really were there's multiple studies out there, but this one was a very nicely done study to show, yes, and we can supplement them with medium chain triglycerides to get them there. The previous study, the one that I started out this talk on, was done showing you the supplements for medium chain triglycerides. When I look at the other parts of a brain disorder that I think are super important, they include things like, Doc, I can't focus. I have memory problems and I don't think it's Alzheimer's. I had a brain injury. I had a concussion. I have chronic headaches. I have depression. I suffer with anxiety. My mood goes up and down. This list of symptoms are all chronic swelling found in brains. From concussions to addiction, to migraines to sleep disorders, these brains are swollen and they're not healthy. When we look at how can we bridge the ketone bridge gap, how can ketones bridge the gap? The important part that I like to have folks remember is this is a very big finding for people when they're struggling. When they come in for depression or when they come in for having had an injury, having had a concussion, when they've had 40 years of migraines, monthly migraines, saying, it's just my period. I'm saying, no, don't do that. Your brain is not going to age well if you do that. And one of the things we start with is improving their ketones, improving how their brain not just ages, but how it's functioning when the symptoms show up and say, I've got brain fog, I just can't seem to figure it out. The part that I want to drive home, though, is that you can't just guess on what your ketones are. You really do have to measure. In the show notes, you'll find my favorite tool, which is ForaCare. I had a patient turn me onto this, saying at least when they buy the expensive strips to measure their ketones, that it works on the first try. So I was a bit frustrated and had found multiple times I was buying these cheap strips for ketones for a different monitor, and dang it, it really, I wasted six of them one time to get my number. But most of them are pretty good, but I really like ForaCare because it is really reliable. And I always think when a diabetic patient tells me which monitor that they like, I should listen and pay attention. So that's how I found ForaCare. But the key thing is people will write in and say, Doc, my friend has Alzheimer's, my friend has a memory problem. Can I give them MCT and can I give them ketones? Can I give them ketones in a can? And I say, yes, you can. But the key component is to measure them. When you're guessing about what your ketones are, and you're saying, I'm not getting the effects I want, you're missing the point of why this diet is such a powerful teaching tool for not just me, not just my colleagues, but patients. I actually am fasting right now and have checked my numbers. This is my glucose number is 65. There you go. And then I checked my ketones right before I started. I'm about 27 hours into my fast. That's a 2.4. So that's a really good Dr. Boz ratio. And I've found that when I do fasting, the reason I do fasting is because of that I like the accountability for knowing what my numbers are too. So we're going to finish out with a few more quick slides to say, here's the punchline. You see all those studies that say, yes, brains do better when they're properly fueled. If you're going to supplement by increasing your ketones, I think you should know this. So let's finish this out. So ketones bridge the brain gap. Yes, they do. And when you look at which ketones are the best, we have a good, we have better, and we have best for ketones. And when I look at what I use for teaching tools for the ketones, if you look at some ketones, they only last 2 to 3 hours in circulation. Other ketones that you can get them up to 2 to 6 hours in circulation. So you can poke your finger for 5.5, 6 hours after taking those types of ketones and find them in circulation. And then there's some that will increase your ketone production for days to weeks afterwards. So let's do the big reveal. What is a good ketone? Good ketones are those made from BHB, otherwise known as beta-hydroxybutyrate. I like to call these ketones in a can. It's because they were made in the 60s. They're not too exciting to make. They're a salt. They don't taste very good, so most of the supplements have a sweetener in them. They're also called exogenous ketones, but they only last for 2 to 3 hours in circulation. So if you're going to use those as a way to improve your ketones, you're going to have to dose several times a day. If you want the next layer of what my recommendations are, medium chain triglycerides. And this is with a specific caveat that these MCTs are C8, C10. Be very careful to look at the label for these supplements, that's the kind you're getting. If you find a really cheap MCT powder or MCT oil, be careful. They're probably putting a bunch of C12 in that, and that does not increase your ketones. That acts just like any other fat. We want these special fats to increase ketones in people who are trying to figure out how to become keto adapted. I often think of these supplement phases for my teenagers because I can get them to take these. We limit their carbs in their diet, but boy, if I'm supplementing, we get a 1-2 knockout punch for helping their ketogenic diet. But more importantly, if somebody's brain isn't working right and I'm trying to get their brain in a better phase, supplementing with BHB or supplementing with MCT, C8, C10 is a great hack to get them over the edge of getting their brain feeling better. Fuel their full brain before you ask them to produce the best kinds of ketones. And that is the fasting. I'm fasting today and showed you my numbers on purpose because I made an improved amount of ketones today because I deprived food for over, I think I'm at 28 hours of fasting. Now, if life goes well, I'll go home and not snitch on supper and I'll get to bed before having any calories and I'll wake up tomorrow morning with a goal of trying to get to like 36 or 40 hours of fasting. If I can do that once a week for the rest of my life, it sounds like a really big goal. When I first started, I wasn't very good at it. But I would contend that if people could do fasting once a week to ignite their autophagy, to ignite the recycling that happens in your body, your brain will last you until the moment God puts you in that grave. I really believe that we can take the power of science, especially in a ketogenic diet, and enhance the brains in my clinic, but also in your home. I hope this lecture series, this slide deck, really drove home the point, which is, yes, you can supplement ketones to get your brain to work better. It is a great way to begin if your brain's not working well, or if you're just not very disciplined about how to get onto a ketogenic diet. Those studies were done on folks who were not on a ketogenic diet and then put on a ketogenic diet. Those studies were done with people who continued to use carbohydrates. They just had to get the ketones high enough in their circulation in order for it to affect their brain. So we could see that the slope that the brain was hungry for ketones was the same in healthy young brains as it was in elderly brains with mild cognitive impairment. And I think that is the most powerful, hopeful thing to offer my patients, which is, look, having Alzheimer's, having a brain that doesn't work is an awful prison as you age. Making sure that your brain has as much fuel as it can burn is one way to awaken that brain in a better functioning setting. So using medium chain triglycerides, using BHB is a safe way to begin, but the best ketones, the ones that I like to use every week, are the ones I find when I fast. That will increase my metabolism for the next week, actually, as I continue on a just normal ketogenic diet after I do my fast. I hope that was helpful. I'm signing off again as Dr. Boz, trying to improve your health one ketone at a time. Until next time.